Hi there, and welcome to the next installment of Space Talks with Z, hosted by the America's Future Series. I'm Z. With us today, we have Bailey and Jack from Aegis Law, an amazing law firm that specializes in helping companies navigate what are becoming more increasingly challenging waters around export control, particularly with technology, and specifically sort of helping a lot of our new space companies. I just want to give a shout out to Millennium Space Systems, TGM Core, Technology Exploration Group, and New Space Finance for supporting this YouTube series. And so without further ado, once again, welcome. And I'm going to start introducing our brilliant guests. We have with us Bailey Reichelt. She is a lawyer, started at the Mississippi State University, then moved to the University of Mississippi School of Law with a JD focused on airspace and remote sensing law. The remote sensing, as you guys know, is something close to my heart, being a detector guy. So, amazing career so far. Worked for a variety of companies in the ecosystem, and then moved into being a partner with Aegis. Along with her is her partner in the company, Jack Shelton. Jack is also an attorney in the space law sector, came out of Colorado College, then a JD with focus on business at Tennessee College of Law, and then Admiralty Law as well at Tulane University Law School. So worked as an attorney for a variety of different law firms, and then joined Aegis with Bailey. But can I toss it over to you, Bailey, to tell us a little more about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, you got the schooling and stuff down. That's where it all started with pursuing space law. Did a little bit of litigation early in my career and then went on to working for some big aerospace defense contractors. That's actually where I started learning export controls and how to make a company, an aerospace company, actually run. I joke that our motto should be, you can't get to orbit if you go to jail. So that's not the official motto, but maybe one day. It's the unofficial motto. Anyway, I love working with the space companies. I left the big defense contractor world working in-house, specifically so we could work with founders and really innovative tech companies. One of my passions and the reason I'm drawn to this field is, one, I can't do math very well. So, I went to law hoping that I could find a way to help all the scientists and engineers out there get their technology to market. I hope that one day the technology they create actually, makes a sizable difference in the world, and that my daughter will grow up in a world that looks markedly different than the one I grew up in because of the technology we enabled and because of the space technology specifically. We already saw the big impact that, just the shuttle missions, the Apollo missions made in contributing to technology, and how it raised accessibility to lots of different things for everyone across the world. And I'd like to see that continue. Hopefully Jack and I, through our law firm, can continue to facilitate that path. But I think one of the funny stories is actually how Jack and I met and how this law firm formed. So I'll let him tell that story and give some more information about himself.
It's the geekiest story about how we met. But yeah, so my background, I came out of law school. I immediately got hired for with an ocean carrier in Germany, and worked as inside counsel with them, handling everything from ship chartering to some piracy issues. From there, went and did the LLM, master's degree in law in Admiralty at Tulane, and stayed in New Orleans for a bit, again, representing ocean carriers, doing a lot of international trade work. That international trade work then, of course, segued into ITAR work. And then, let's see, the ITAR work got me into putting together educational content online. I actually made a video on YouTube called ITAR in 10 minutes. If you search for ITAR on YouTube, you ought to find that real quick. But Bailey saw that video before we'd ever met, and she commented on it. And she said that she was using it with the defense contractor she was at, and actually using it for training materials. And so we kind of became friends that way. I started helping her put training materials together. And that's actually a big part of what we do now is we train our corporate clients in how to not violate the ITAR and the Export Administration regulations and other regulatory schemes that they have to deal with every day. So yeah, I've worked for a few different law firms over the years, some bigger firms. Felt like I wasn't nimble enough working with bigger firms and couldn't really make the right decisions that I wanted to make in terms of how I'd practiced. And so broke off on my own, asked Bailey to leave her defense contractor and come work with me. Then we dove headfirst into the space world and haven't really looked back since.
It's amazing. And what a wonderful organic startup story of your own. So you're on the journey along with, and you're helping out other founders on this journey. So, you know, one of the things is the basics. A lot of people are intimidated by them. I'm sure you've encountered this in your careers. It seems like legal gobbledygook that is just challenging for businesses to work with. And so I know that we're going to get into a variety of topics in regards to export control and having foreign persons part of the team, things like C.L.A.S, which has caused some major changes at new space companies. But before that, perhaps as we had discussed, you could jump into some of the basics, Jack.
Sure. And just kind of give an overview of the topic. I mean, we're going to start with export controls. But broadly, the question that we get asked about the most probably is, hey, we want to work with this foreign engineer, or we want to take a foreign investment, and what are all the implications there? Probably the most consistent theme in this industry is, how do we work with foreign persons? How do we take foreign money? And so that is what we're going to talk about today. And it's a theme that goes through export controls. C.F.I.U.S, for those who don't know, that's Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. You know, foreign sanctions, and even payload review, as we saw with Firefly, and before that with
Momentous.
Sorry. There's too many space companies that begin with an M. Awesome. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get in. I'll pull my slide deck up.
Great. What's become funny about space company naming, I feel, is that there's so many, all the companies that could stick space in their name have done so already. So now there's some names that you'd have no idea that there was anything to do with space. So we're seeing.
All right, so really brief intro to export controls. There's a few different buckets that we like to think of when we're thinking about export controls. There's a few different regulatory regimes that deal with the licensing of exports from the United States. And that includes licensing of exports of technology. So everybody's heard of the ITAR, right? International Traffic in Arms Regulations. There's another bucket, another regulatory scheme called the Export Administration Regulations. And then the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there's two different sets of regs there. We kind of lump those together because we don't have to deal with them very much. But that's dealing with nuclear stuff. So just for example, the Perseverance rover has a nuclear battery on it. The folks who put that together would have had to think about Department of Energy and Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations. And there are certain lists of things in those regulations that say this is what these regulations apply to. So essentially, you just look at those lists, make sure your stuff's not on there. If your stuff's not on there, you don't even have to think about those regulations. Next, we look at the ITAR. ITAR deals with things like rockets. It also deals with satellites. And there's a specific list in the ITAR called the U.S. munitions list. So if you want to find out if ITAR applies to your stuff, you look at that list. If your stuff is not listed on that list, then you know the ITAR doesn't apply to you. So then we take a look at the EAR. And you'll notice these buckets are getting bigger. The EAR is the biggest bucket because it deals with the most stuff. Essentially everything that's not listed in either of these two regs is going to fall under the EAR. So for example, something as mundane as a bicycle, it's going to be regulated by the Export Administration regulations. Now, really boring stuff like bicycles, the regulations that apply to them are obviously not going to be very stringent, right? We call these things EAR 99 items. An EAR 99 item isn't listed anywhere. It's not actually listed in the EAR. So anything from bubblegum to paper clips to cats and dogs, these are things that aren't listed in the EAR. Nevertheless, EAR applies to them. So we also do have a list in the EAR, and it's called the Commerce Control List. And the Commerce Control List is going to govern things like satellite ground stations. Now, some of you have heard that the Commerce Control List, it applies to what we call dual use items. And a dual use item is something that might have a military purpose, but it might also have a commercial purpose. So obviously ground stations are things that can be used with the military or commercial space. But it's incorrect to say that the Commerce Control List just deals with dual use items. In fact, there's a lot of stuff on the Commerce Control List that has no real potential military use, including horses. There's horses transported by sea are on the Commerce Control List, as well as a bunch of other kind of random weird things. And then aside from the regulations that govern licensing of exports, EAR, ITAR, and these other regs over here, there's also something called the OFAC regulations. This is the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And OFAC deals with foreign sanctions. So this isn't necessarily an export licensing regime. Rather, it's a lot of sanctions that say, essentially, you can't do business with certain people. And there's a whole bunch of lists here too. So for example, Kim Jong-un is going to be on one of these lists. You can't do business with him. You've also got companies on these lists, and you've got countries like Cuba on these lists. So obviously, you all know you can't deal with Iran, you can't deal with Cuba, you can't deal with North Korea. And so these are kind of broad-based sanctions. So all of these things you need to be thinking about when you are trying to determine, can I export my stuff to a certain country, or can I show my stuff to a person who's from one of these countries? A minute ago, we talked about the Commerce Control List, and we were talking about how it's not just dual use items. I'll show you a couple more funny things on there just to kind of drive the point home. Horses transported by sea is an odd one. Western red cedar, it's just wood, obviously not a dual use thing. Paraffin, that's what crayons and candles are made out of. So high-powered computers, this is funny. When the PlayStation, I think it was the PlayStation 2, when it first hit the market, it was considered a high-powered computer that was high-powered enough to be on one of these lists. Now, perhaps the list hadn't been updated enough at the time, but it's something to keep in mind. If you've got a very high-powered computer that you're dealing with, you might want to check. Life jackets, this one's bizarre. There's a whole bunch of stuff relating to like scuba diving, but like a life jacket that you pick up at the dollar store, it's on the Commerce Control List, and it's got, and you might not be able to export it to certain countries. So there are some things on that list that are fairly mundane. All right, so what kinds of categories of things are controlled? So first, we've got physical things. And physical things, typically, you'll see the word commodities used in both the ITAR and the EAR. And commodities can comprise both end items, which is like the ultimate complete thing that you're trying to, like for example, a satellite, you're going to actually send up into space. It's the end item is the complete thing. And then you've got parts, components, attachments, and accessories. And the reason I note this is because these things might be listed separately in the EAR or the ITAR, and they might have slightly different rules that apply to them. So for example, you might need a license to export the end item, but maybe you don't need a license to export a part, but maybe you do if it's a component. So you need to classify your stuff correctly based on what it actually is. Aside from physical things, you've also got information. And this is one of the trickiest things about export controls that people new to it don't quite get right away. Under the ITAR, we call information technical data, and under the EAR, we call it technology. But basically what is regulated is information necessary to do certain things with other things that are listed. So for example, under the ITAR, if you've got a piece of hardware that's listed on the ITAR, well, technical data is going to be information necessary for the development, production, operation, installation, repair, or doing certain other things with that piece of hardware. Same thing under the EAR. And so how might this information manifest itself? Well, you might have written or even oral communications. So for example, you can just like orally describe how to operate a certain piece of hardware. And that is deemed to be technology or technical data that's subject to ITAR and EAR. You know, blueprints, of course, and technical drawings, photographs. There's even some instances where you could have visual inspection. Like if you were to take apart a device and show it to somebody and they could see how all of the internal bits are laid out, that might constitute the sort of technology or technical data that's controlled, and you might be deemed to be exporting that information when you do it. Also, we've got software. So for example, you might need software to actually operate a satellite that's up in orbit. So what is an export now? This is a really tricky area. Obviously, any physical movement out of the United States is going to be an export. So it can be cargo shipments or, like a simple parcel delivery. In-person movement as well. This happens quite a bit where, you're going to a trade show and you've got a piece of technology or a piece of hardware in your backpack or your suitcase, and you travel out of the country. That is an export. Now, it's incredibly important to note that an export is any movement or transmission of these things out of the United States. And one thing that happens sometimes when somebody screws this up is they'll take something out of the United States. For example, they're taking it to a trade show and they'll say, well, I wasn't planning on selling it, and I was only taking it out of the country for a moment, and then I was bringing it back. So it's not an export. And we have to explain, well, yeah, it is an export. Literally anytime something moves out of the United States, that's going to be an export with very few exceptions. So your purpose doesn't matter. It doesn't matter why you're taking it out of the US. And it doesn't matter whether you're selling the thing or even if you're just keeping it to yourself, it's still an export. To drive this point home, just imagine that you're in your car and you've gone to McDonald's and you've got a Happy Meal, and your Happy Meal is sitting shotgun in the car, and you accidentally drive across the border into Mexico, and you immediately cross the border right again into Texas. Well, you've just exported that Happy Meal. Doesn't matter that you accidentally went to Mexico. It doesn't matter that the thing isn't necessarily controlled. It's EAR 99. It doesn't matter that you weren't trying to sell it or anything. You have exported that Happy Meal. So it's really important just to understand that concept of what an export is. So that's, it's kind of easier to conceptualize when we're talking about physical stuff. It's a lot more difficult to conceptualize when we're talking about information. And we're just going to kind of touch on this kind of broadly. There's a million caveats when we're talking about information, but generally any transmission of data out of the United States is going to be an export. So for example, if you email something to somebody in a foreign country, if you upload information to a server that's in another country or that foreign people have access to, that's going to be an export. Obviously, you can have information on your laptop as well, or your cell phone, and you take that out of the country. And surely everybody's heard of a deemed export, and this is one of those really tricky things that gets people in trouble. And this is also what implicates issues when you're trying to hire somebody. So a deemed export is when you are in the United States. So let's imagine this is my office in Texas. And let's imagine that I've got technical data all over the place. I've got an actual physical satellite sitting on the floor. I've got technical data up on my laptop. I've got it on a whiteboard, and I'm talking about technical data orally. So let's say that I hire a Chinese engineer and I want her to work on this stuff with me. Or even this is a person who's just on a tour walking through the facility and she can see this stuff. So she's able to see technical data up on the whiteboard. She's able to see it on computer. She's able to hear the things that I'm orally communicating. She can see the physical stuff. Maybe I've got blueprints laying around. These are things that can get me into trouble, because when she sees these things, since she's a foreign person and not a US person, I am deemed to be exporting this stuff to China. As we all know, in this industry, that is a very bad no-no thing to do. So the obvious question then is, what is a foreign person? The word person in law, generally, it's not just dealing with export controls, but anytime you're dealing with laws or contracts, and you see the word person, person has a few different meanings. It doesn't just mean humans. So you can have humans. You can also have what we call juridical persons. These are things like corporations and LLCs. Government agencies can also have personhood, meaning they can sign contracts, they can have obligations and rights, and things like that. So when we're talking about humans, a foreign person is any human who is not a US citizen or US national, also a human who's not a green card holder, and a human who's not in the US under asylum or refugee status. So if a person is none of these things, then they are a foreign person. So for example, somebody who is in the US on a work visa, but who does not yet have a green card and obviously doesn't have US citizenship, that person is going to be a foreign person. Of course, you can also have a foreign business. This is a business entity that is incorporated or organized outside the United States. So a German GmbH, for example, is going to be a foreign person. Again, this can get a little tricky because sometimes that German GmbH might have American employees or sales agents working for it. And so you also need to be thinking about, okay, I'm talking to an American human, but he's an agent for this foreign organization. So you need to be thinking about, is my giving this information to this American human actually an export to this foreign company? And then finally, of course, you've got foreign governments. Obviously, those aren't going to be US persons. Those are going to be foreign persons. All right, so there's a few instances in which, aside from the normal physical exports of things and then the exports of information, including deemed exports, there's a few particular issues where transferring registration, control, or ownership of a thing can also be considered an export. Under the ITAR, transferring registration, control, or ownership of a satellite also doesn't apply in the space world, but aircraft and ocean vessels also applies here. If you transfer the registration, control, or ownership to a foreign person of a satellite, that is an export, even if the thing remains in the United States and you haven't physically delivered it. And then under the EAR, EAR talks about spacecraft. And it says that if you transfer registration, control, or ownership to a person who is in another country or who is a national of another country, that is considered an export as well. All right, so that's kind of it for export controls. Wanted to really lay the foundation there so we understood what was going on with export controls. I think we can probably drop the PowerPoint for now and get into a little bit more of a discussion about some of the issues involved with some of the other regulatory agencies like FAA, CFIUS, et cetera. And yeah, maybe take this away from the whole lecture PowerPoint format.
You know, first of all, thank you, Jack, and I'm sure, and I know Bailey, you helped put that together. So thank you both. That was an extremely lucid crash course. Just so that our viewer understand this, that crash course does not make you necessarily capable of running out there and classifying everything in your stockroom yourself. There's a lot of detail when you look at these lists, and when you get into the minutia about how to classify, how to understand the processes. And that's really where your team comes in to help people navigate that and simply be right, because this is an arena where you have to be right. You can't best guess is not good enough. I think, I've collected a couple of questions that I know also part of from my students at Thunderbird, who are a good representative set of people working at institutions, large space companies, Blue Origin, SpaceX, etc., all the way to entrepreneurs, and then around that. So I've got a couple questions that they have, but before I jump into that, I do want to mention. I think I have an idea why the PlayStation was on there, because years ago, a team that I was a program manager for came to me and said, "Hey, we need to buy a bunch of PlayStations." And I said, "Ha ha ha, that's funny." I thought it was some sort of joke, talking about love to give them away at the Christmas party. No, we bought, I forget how many, it was between 200 and 300. And we set them up in what's called a Beowulf cluster, which is basically a baby supercomputer. Because at the time, they were the cheapest GPUs you could get. And you network them up with fiber. And we actually ran NMCNP, nuclear Monte Carlo particle simulations on that. And I think that type of applicability might have been why the PlayStation ended up on that list.
Dude, I love talking to you. This is why I like working with you so much, is because you always have amazing stories that add color to the things that we don't understand. Z, we were talking yesterday about how this is what's the word that we used? It's like you're cross training constantly, right? Right. It's a multidisciplinary endeavor all the time, and so we always learn a lot from you.
Oh, and likewise. And so, on that note, maybe I can toss this at you, Bailey, to kick us off a little bit with this discussion. What's come up, a couple of my students are entrepreneurs, and a couple are venture capitalists, and they both agreed on this kind of question. That's something that is really concerning to them, is when you're looking at foreign money, what kind of constitutes that, and what are kind of the levels that you get concerned about, and are there third rails that are involved? And what I think our audience would love to hear what your approach is to dealing with those types of questions, and really how one might frame thinking about that. Perhaps that you could kick us off.
Yeah, sure. Actually, so the rest of the slide deck does actually go into CFIUS and the foreign investment. So we have some slides on this that we can go into later. But sure, so I kind of lump this broadly into two categories in my head. You can have foreign ownership and control of your company, or you can be accepting foreign money. And it's when that foreign money takes ownership or control to certain levels that you have to start mitigating the control and the ownership structure. And what that can look like is changing the structure. So you eliminate the control or ownership, or get it down to an acceptable level, just generally a percentage. And it's different depending on what laws you're looking at, right? So if you're looking at CFIUS, it's different percentages versus if you're looking at some other regulations like registering to be a government contractor and trying to apply for CBIR. Ownership and control standards apply there too. And you just have to look at the different laws to know what that level is and how they're defining ownership and control. One point I'd like to make is frequently people conflate the terms ownership and control. I think we can elaborate on that a little as we go through our slides, but we'll be talking about who has voting rights, who owns what, do they have a seat on the board, what are they actually entitled to? I think that kind of answers your question. I can't get much more specific
Yeah.
without having a specific set of laws to go into.
So there's one thing we need to be thinking about is CFIUS.
Right.
We also need to be thinking about the National Security Review when you're going to have a launch, and then the payload review, because we saw what happened with Firefly and what happened with Momentous. But let's start with CFIUS. So CFIUS is the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. And this is an agency, or it's not an agency, it's a committee. And it's a committee made up of different agencies. So there's people from State Department, there's people from Department of Defense. And what they're doing is they're looking at certain transactions that are typically in the form of an investment. So maybe a foreign person purchasing equity in a US company. And they're looking to determine if a foreign person is gaining control. They're looking at whether the company is involved in something called critical technology. They're looking at whether the company is going to gain access to material non-public information, which might be ITAR data, for example, or it might be certain other things.
Classified contracts would be another consideration here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what CFIUS can do, if they think that a certain investment poses a national security risk, and that might mean a lot of things, it can be very broad, and it's up to their interpretation. But if they think that there's a national security risk posed by an investment, what they can do is they can then make a recommendation to the president that the president force you to unwind the transaction. Now, what they'll do is they'll tell you that they're going to make that recommendation, and then you yourself unwind the transaction, because it's only happened a couple of times that they've actually had to make that recommendation, and then the president always does what they recommend. So you know it's coming, so you fix it first. There's certain instances in which if you've got one of these transactions under certain circumstances, you actually have to report to CFIUS and let them know that you've got this transaction that might pose a problem for them. There's other instances in which you don't have to, but maybe you want to. The reason why you might want to make a voluntary disclosure is because they can bless the transaction. They can essentially say, hey, it looks like you have enough risk mitigation in place here, or this foreign investor clearly isn't gaining any control, or you don't really have critical technology that we care about, and they can then say, this looks fine. And once they do that, they're basically prevented from coming back later and causing problems.
On that same investment.
On that same investment, exactly. Based on the information that you told them, obviously.
Right.
If they think that you lied to them or left out material information, they can always come back.
Sure.
But I mean, a lot of companies do that. They'll make these voluntary disclosures because they just want that stamp of approval. I mean, especially if you're talking about a massive investment and you're going public in the future.
Right. There's a lot of risk mitigation.
Incredibly devastating for that to come back later.
Mm-hmm.
It can also be devastating when years down the road, you're about to put something into space. And this is when the FAA comes into play. So under the FAA regulations, this is in part 450. This is the new regulations for licensing of launch and reentry vehicles. There's a payload. There's a review process for national security where they're looking holistically at the launch and everything involved in the launch to determine whether there's a national security risk. And part of that review is the payloads that are actually going into space. Now, if you're not the launch company, let's say that you just own and operate one of the payloads that's going up there, you can independently request a review of your payload. And this can take some of the burden off of the launch company, because they might be launching a whole bunch of different stuff up there. And so as the payload owner, you can independently ask, hey, review my thing separately. Streamlines everything for the launch company. And so regardless of whether you ask for that separate review, FAA is going to be reviewing your stuff to determine if they think there's a problem. And guess what? It's not just the FAA. They're going to bring in NASA. They're going to bring in DOD. They're going to bring in Department of State and Commerce. And essentially, they're going to have a very similar review to the CFIUS review. And this is the stage at which some of these companies have seen problems and have had to excise some of their foreign ownership and control.
So staying at kind of a top level view of this, one of the things that I think there's confusion about is that this declaration and dealing with CFIUS is for any investment, whether you're selling to the government or not. Is that correct? Right. So because I think there's a perception that, hey, I'm not doing government contracting. I'm just launching a satellite and I'm going to sell my data to vineyards in California about how well their grapes are doing this year and whether or not we're going to have, good Cabernet or bad Cabernet. But
just to elaborate a little bit. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, go on, please.
Yeah, so the investments, it's not all investments, right?
Okay.
Specifically, there's a concept called greenfield investments that's carved out. And so if you're actually establishing a new company in the US, that's actually carved out from under this. You would have to do this via foreign investment in an already established US entity.
Yeah, that's when CFIUS gets involved. That's essentially the scope of their jurisdiction. There's an existing business of some sort, and then a foreign person comes in and invests in it. And
we have a lot of, sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just gonna say we have a lot of clients who have maybe a foreign owner that wants to set up an affiliate entity or something in the US. CFIUS does not apply to that situation.
That's right.
Got it. Yeah. So it's you've got an ostensibly American company that's now bringing in foreign money. And what's that effect of that going to be? Now, what's interesting is that, right, at some level, this is only, the scrutiny is only going to increase given the current environment with everything that's happening in Europe right now. And although the Department of Justice's China initiative has been scaled back, regardless, the scrutiny in general seems to remain on investment from foreign companies into U.S. companies. How do you see this affecting the way that new space and perhaps even any innovators in technology have to think about how they raise funds? Because again, this begs the question: is it only when there are individuals, kind of an angel investor or a big fish coming in and buying a stake, or is it even just for example, Seraphim out of UK, which is an ally. But they're making significant investments in American new space companies, particularly in the early stage. So oftentimes their stake is significant. So how should founders and venture capitalists, et cetera, think about that? Because this affects many things.
So if we're talking purely about fundraising, the way we deal with this is making sure that we have purely passive investments. So I want to say it was 2018 when the latest updates to everything CFIUS were made. There was a new law passed called FIRRMA, FIRRMA, and that made some updates. It included like the mandatory disclosure requirements for certain instances and things like that. And when that happened, some of the folks in the government involved with CFIUS came out and did a whole bunch of press releases and talks and things like that. And they've gone on the record saying, even if you've got an investment from China, if it's a purely passive investment that grants no control or no rights other than just, rights like if I were to buy Apple stock, there's no way I'm gaining any sort of control or insider knowledge into Apple when I buy Apple stock. If you can have a purely passive investment, they don't care about that. And so you structure it in such a way that you make sure it's purely passive. Obviously, when you've got an already IPO'd company that's freely trading stock on the market, it's easier to have purely passive investments. When you're a small company looking for VC money,
A little different.
It's a little different. And so you have to make sure you structure it right, and you're not giving board seats, and you're not giving people rights to elect people to the board, and you're not giving any sort of board oversight, and you're not allowing them to have any kind of control over the decision making.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jack. There are specific rules in the regs under the CFIUS rules about having investment organizations involved, right? They kind of have their own little carve out for what's acceptable there.
There's a lot of details.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Yeah,
details
of
there,
course.
but there's ways to handle these situations.
Yeah.
And so if you know, what's one of the things that founders, CEOs of early stage, even to mid stage companies have to do a lot of is the investor relation piece. And so this seems to be complicating investor relations. Is that something that your team will help create a plan for or influence in part of your work with these companies?
100%. It's something that we have to deal with a lot. And it's something that you have to be proactively thinking about. One of the ways we've structured our law firm is we tend to operate as outside general counsel. We want to be there with our clients as they grow. We try not to take a lot of ad hoc work, because ad hoc work tends to come after somebody's really screwed something up. And so we want to make sure that we're involved with teams on an ongoing basis, so that we're helping them issue spot. And of course, when you've got a young company, typically the CEO is an engineer, right? And they've got engineering problems they're trying to deal with, and they're also trying to raise money, and they're also trying to develop their team and deal with internal HR policies and issues, and trying to make sure their website looks good and attend conferences. And with all of these things going on in their heads, they're not thinking about some of these CFIUS issues and some of these problems that can come about if they're giving access to some of their maybe ITAR controlled data to a foreign person. So it's good to have somebody on your team at an early stage. Doesn't matter if it's us or somebody who's another compliance person, but it's good to have somebody early on who can help you with these. One
of the concepts I just wanted to bring up, and this is not legal advice, I'm pretty sure I have to say that, this is just advice from Bailey. There's a concept called end use controls and end use checks, and it goes across all the different compliance laws and regs. You should be, if you're taking investment or you want to do a joint venture, if you want to export to a company you've never exported before, you should be asking questions about the end use and the end user that you're working with. This doesn't stop at just that entity, especially for investments. You want to know if this is another company making investments, okay, well, who owns that company? You do need to do some due diligence on who's investing and chase it up the chain a little bit, because even if you have that one Russian owner, you know, who's like 3 levels up in the holding companies, that could be an issue. And as Jack said, we like to be a part of the team when they start talking to different investors to be like, let's ask a few questions. Let's don't just take their money. I know lots of small businesses and startups are very eager to get rolling with partners, and especially international partners, and get investments in. We like to enable them to do that, but in a smart way, so that we don't run into these massive issues on the back end.
And you know, your advice of being proactive is so important. About mid last year, a investment organization for which I'm an advisor had a set of funds get stopped in the Netherlands twice. For some reason, they couldn't get the funds to clear in this investment. It was sizable, multiples of 7 figures. And I get a call from the principal on the fund saying, Z, I know you know things and used to do things. Can you help me investigate this? Because I'm at a loss, and this is and we're leveraged, etc. This is the problem. we either need to know we're going to get these funds or we're not, and what to do. And so I activated a couple of resources, called a friend who says, "Hey, Z, this sounds like AML, anti-money laundering." I then, based off of that, we looked at who were the principals in the firm that was ostensibly doing the investment. We had somebody who we thought was possibly the concerning party, and that turned out, it was very interesting. As we investigated, that turned out to be a red herring, and it turned out to be exactly what you said, Bailey, 3 levels deep. The money was coming out of the Middle East, and even though the country was okay, the individual had ties to bad things, and so that money all the way through was tagged, and it had gone from a Middle Eastern country to Eastern European country to a Western European country, and now it's trying to come over into an American fund. And to us, it just looked like a firm out of the Netherlands. Right. So just to your point this is not academic at all. This really matters, and the rubber met the road when Interpol was tracing that money stream, and they wouldn't let them transfer, and so actually some government on our side, some government agencies, we gave them the information about this. They ended up hooking up with Interpol and then stopped talking to us, which probably means that it became part of an investigation. But it was very instructive to me, in terms of, like, this is to me a real example of what you're talking about. Although it's anti-money laundering, not CFIUS.
It's actually a great thing to bring up. I've had a client who's had a very similar issue, and there's actually 2 points to make here. One is just reiterating the point that Bailey made. It's that so with OFAC, all the foreign sanctions and everything, let's say that I'm dealing with a particular company, and the company is not on any of the bad guy lists, right? And so I'm feeling pretty warm and fuzzy. But if that company is more than 50% owned by a person who is on a bad guy list, then they treat that company as if the whole company's on a bad guy list, even though it's not listed anywhere. So I have to ask, who owns the company? Well, what if there's a parent company? Right. There's a grandparent company. And so you got to trace it up the chain. And frankly, it's sometimes difficult to do when you're doing business. Like, let's say, you're kind of making a couple small trades with a foreign company, and you start asking them questions like that. They're like, we're not going to tell you. And so sometimes you have to make a strategic decision about whether you're going to do business with somebody based on what they're willing to tell you.
That's what we would call a red flag if they won't give you that information.
Okay, right. It's not good enough to just say, well, we want to keep that information proprietary or private, right? Hey, we've got NDAs, we've got paper between us. You can sue us if we disclose it. Why can't you give up the goods on who's controlling? Yeah. So that's really interesting.
Most legitimate organizations are definitely going to understand that you're doing that. They've probably dealt in US export controls before. And the really low-hanging fruit, especially if they are on like a bad guy list, there's actually a free tool out there. It's called the Consolidated Screening List. And you can go screen names of companies and people on this list, and it'll tell you if they're on one of the lists kept by the government. And there are a lot of lists. So I would strongly suggest using the Consolidated Screening tool if you don't have another paid screening tool. And if you don't have a compliance program, that should be your starting point. Absolutely. At least screen all parties to your transactions through the Consolidated Screening List. That's a very easy way to get in a lot of trouble, is to do business with someone on one of those lists.
One other point on anti-money, talking over you. One other point on anti-money laundering. I've got a client who had an issue like this arise. He was developing a factory, I can't remember for what, in Montana, and he got a very sizable investment from somebody who had foreign accounts. And it was a similar situation what you just said, Z, except there weren't any bad actors involved. There was nobody who was on any bad guy lists, nobody who was sanctioned as a terrorist or anything like that. But the money came from the Middle East and then went down to the Caymans and then came back up to Europe and then came over to the United States. And simply because of where the money was going and bouncing around, the government looked at it and said, hold on, that's not, we're going to grab that and hold on to it for a little while because we're worried that this is a money laundering issue. We're worried about the origin of this money, and we're going to investigate you now. So you just need to be aware that if money is following kind of untraditional paths, that can sometimes cause problems.
That's really interesting. You know, I want to. We've got a bit of time left. I've got about 20 minutes, or 15. Then before we want to start wrapping up, I want to shift gears a little bit to the other side of this. Right? We've talked about investment. We've talked about capital, control, and control. But the other part is collaborations and human resources. Right, the people you're dealing with, and one of the things that in my career has been really amazing is particularly with people doing research and innovation. They're very open by nature. You know, it's different if they work for you know, a CIA lab, of course, you know, that's different. But in general, these people are very open. They like to go to conferences. They like to go have coffee. And when you go to these conferences, it's all the best talent available, which means by nature that it's international and it's extremely diverse. And so what you find is that, or at least I found, is trying to get it through people's into people's mental framework that coffee with your colleague from Dubai could be deemed as an export. So how when you're advising companies proactively and post-actively, and certainly and clearly there are going to be differences. How do you guys approach that in terms of building that for their collaborative and people policies, and also even just, you know, like you said, the joint ventures, for example, where it's not like somebody's taking control, but you have to work with a foreign company closely just to get your product to market, for example.
So I want to start here, and because we've said a lot of things that should scare you, I want to tell you some good news to make you, you know, not just associate lawyers with no. We don't like that. The good news is there are ways to deal with all of this, and they're not that difficult. If you want to hire a foreign employee and you can't find any exceptions applicable or ways to stop them from having access to controlled information, you can simply get a license. Yes, you can license more than hardware. You can also license information, and you can license your foreign employee to receive that information so that you don't have to like restrict them only to the lobby area and give them an escort around your building. Also good news, if you want to go to a conference, there's carve-outs all through the export administration regulations, and some even under the ITAR, for what level of information you can comfortably share. Like marketing level information is widely carved out and distributed. Even under the EAR, if it's something that's customarily exchanged to support a bid proposal, and it can even be a bid proposal to a foreign government, if it's normally exchanged to support that type of activity, then there's a carve out under the EAR. So there is a wide swath of things, and also things that are published. If it's on the internet under the EAR, they don't control it. There's lots of things that are carved out, and it's pretty easy, especially if you're in the EAR. A little bit more tricky and detail oriented under the ITAR. Okay, so that's all the good news. There are ways to deal with all of this. When you get to employees specifically, if you want to bring a foreign employee in, you want to put them under a license, you do normally create something called a technology control plan, which will state like who their supervisor is, that they understand what areas they're restricted to, has maybe a map of their facility access, and all the rules that are going to apply to them to make sure they stay within the bounds of their license. So we have forms and templates and very established mechanisms for dealing with these scenarios. Great.
No,
actually, there wasn't anything bad there.
Yeah, it's great news. That's great news. So we can deal with it, but you need the right advice and help with that process. So that's, but all of that's a proactive approach.
Yeah, one of the things I should have mentioned earlier when we were talking about export controls, and it's always difficult to take a broad topic and make it just
right.
part
Of course.
But ITAR and EAR restrict exports of controlled things, but they don't say thou shalt not ever export these things. What they say is you can't export these things if you don't have a license, or if a license exception doesn't apply. So first, if your thing is on one of these lists and you're trying to export it by disclosing deemed information or making a deemed export in the United States to a foreign employee, for example, you can get a license to do it. You ask the government for permission, and often, depending on the circumstances, the government actually gives you permission to do it. It's not impossible.
I also wanted to let you know that you're not going to jail if you took a Happy Meal in your car to Mexico. That's not going to be a violation. Some of you may have been scared. That's not a violation. It's not a thing that requires a license, so you were good. You didn't need to ask the government's permission. You're fine. Now, you can't take it to Iran, but that's a whole different topic.
I do remember, right, there was a character in the old days from the McDonald's ads, the bandit, the Burger Bandit. Now, Hamburger, that's what it was. The Hamburger. Now this is something the Hamburger would do, though, right? Is to try to run away with the car full of Happy Meals to Mexico in the hopes that he would not get caught. But
and sell them to the small.
Exactly, and sell them to the locals. But now let's flip that. Instead of hamburgers, right? We're talking about microchips. Right, or we're talking about high-end software, high-end computers, for example, and some of these are sold into, for example, China, and what's happening with the space economy is that people are realizing that it's born global, it's born interconnected, in a way that is both wonderful, but it's also challenging. Because everybody feels like, hey, I need to access these markets. We need to work together with these companies. So to sort of zoom out a little bit, just philosophically, mentally, right? There's a load of risks in all of that, right? There's the CFIUS, there's the ITAR EAR. There's also IP risk. There's investment. The color of money, investment risk. So kind of, and there's a culture, particularly for the defense-facing companies, that's growing around the concept of secure capital. I forget what is it NYI or NYC? Know your capital, know your investor type concept.
NYC is the acronym. Know your customer.
Right. Know your customer. I remember actually the flip of that. We used to buy photo multiplier tubes from a Japanese company, and they wanted us to sign a piece of paper that said this would not be used to develop nuclear weapons. And of course, I was literally working for the Nevada test site, helping build a better nuclear bomb, while wanting to have these. So we went through some acrobatics to be able to acquire them.
You might have violated their export controls.
I think I had some sort of national security exception to be able to sign it.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I don't know if I violated Japanese law, but I didn't violate American law.
So one of the things you brought up is red flags.
Right.
Under export controls and a lot of other regulatory regimes, it's not enough to say, I didn't have active knowledge that this thing was going to go wrong. It's not enough. You can't stick your head in the sand. And so you have what's called a duty of inquiry. You've got inquiry notice. If you see something funny, you got to say something, right? And so they give a lot of examples of this. Like, let's say that somebody's asking you for a 5-axis milling machine, a big CNC machine, which is on the Commerce Control List. And you're trying to figure out who the end user is. And you see it's a bakery in a particular country, and you're like, why does a bakery need a
5-axis mill? Yeah,
that doesn't make any sense. Obviously, this isn't the real purchaser. I need to find out who the real purchaser is. And so you got to ask some questions. And the rules say that if there's a red flag, you need to follow up. Now, you can satisfy yourself if you get what looks like a legitimate answer. Your duty of inquiry might stop, and maybe it's okay to go ahead with the transaction. But if you don't get a good answer, and you go ahead and go through with the transaction, the government might come after you and say that you didn't really make a good enough effort.
Just to add on, you can have a red flag that's resolved as
Yeah.
well. Like it's just a caution. It's not a stop, don't do business. It's a just ask an additional question.
Have to figure it
Now
out.
that bakery could legitimately be turning into a machine shop. Maybe they sold everything off and the owner's son is really just into machinery and doesn't want to follow his dad's legacy in baking. There are answers that could satisfy your due diligence. Now, whether that answer satisfies your due diligence or not, I'm not going to comment on. But there are absolutely peculiar situations that throw up red flags that can be resolved.
100%.
That's awesome. So, we're approaching the hour. I want to give both of you an opportunity for kind of a last thought. And what might be interesting is to, we've covered so many topics. We've touched upon them. Really, what companies need to do, very honestly, if they're interested, concerned, or just embarking on a journey, is talk to you or talk to your colleagues, if not you, but talk to you and get their heads wrapped around all these things, because this is clearly, something that you have to deal with, and not just at scale. You don't have to be Momentous. You don't have to be Firefly. You could be, space startup number 585 with some seed money, and it could still be a big deal for your firm. So, I'd love to toss it, at you guys for, Bailey first for your kind of last, what would you say to companies to wrap this discussion up right now, and then thinking about the future?
I have one parting bit of knowledge to add to this. Just because you're not actively exporting at this time does not mean you're free of obligations under US export laws. We're dealing with this a lot right now with a lot of movement of things to the Ukraine. Even if you only ever sold domestically, if you're manufacturing things are controlled, you may still have an obligation to know these regs and maybe even register with the State Department. So don't think that because you're tiny and you're not actively doing anything with anyone internationally, that you don't have any obligation whatsoever. You should educate yourself if you're in this field at all. Because export controls will apply to you at some point, whether it's because you're 3 tiers down from a prime contractor who flows down at like a DD 234 from their government contract. Any of those things can start to implicate these laws and bind you to them. So you need to be ready to deal with them, or it may stall your business, your ability to proceed with business.
Jack?
Yeah, so one parting thought, again, we're just touching on issues like you said, Z. We put out a ton of free content on our website and on LinkedIn. We've been doing a series of space law FAQs. I slowed down a little bit because I had a baby born a couple months ago, so I haven't done one lately, but I'm trying to kick that back off again. But we've got like a series of 1-minute videos, just like rapid fire answering questions. We've got a wiki on our website where we're just delving into all kinds of issues, and it's really good information. We spend a lot of time trying to make concise and easy to read for somebody who's not involved in this day to day. I think we can probably drop a link to our website in the comments.
Oh yeah, no, it's going to be below in the comments, folks. Links to the Aegis Trade Law website, links to Jack and Bailey's LinkedIn profiles, so that everyone can reach out, connect, learn more, and figure out what makes sense for them, how it makes sense for you and your organization to engage. What's really clear, though, in this discussion, to me, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Very clearly in this discussion, and there were a couple things that were said here, and I just to me, you guys are amazingly quotable. Jack, the duty of inquiry. So, companies and my friends in the audience, right? You have a duty of inquiry. You don't get to say, as the cops always said, ignorance of the law is not a defense. But in this case, it's a little deeper in that see something, say something, and you have to investigate when something is reasonably off. And then the other quote, which I think I'd love to end with, Bailey, you can't get to orbit if you go to jail. That's the bottom line. That's the bottom line. You know, as a manager, as an executive, I've always said legal and finance keeps me out of jail and out of the poorhouse. And so I hope my friends in the audience that you reach out, engage with Jack, engage with Bailey. They are true experts in their fields, and every day their amount of knowledge and experience grows. They're serving the ecosystem with all the tremendous amount of thought leadership and content that they're putting out. So I'd just like to wrap again with thanks again for watching. This is Space Talks with Z. I'm Z, hosted by the America's Future Series. Once again, a shout out to Millennium Space Systems, Viasat, TGM Core, Technology Exploration Group, and New Space Finance for helping make this possible. We hope you learned something. Pretty much, if you watch this, you have to have learned a lot. And I just want everyone to again keep in mind that this is a really deep topic. We've touched on a lot of things. You need to engage the right resources and jump into what and how things apply to you. Bye for now, and you know, the sky is no longer the limit.